So I have to start with an admission that my abstract was far too ambitious. So I'm probably not going to be able to do everything that I wanted to do in that, but I'll try. Okay, so photographic scale. This paper is part of a project that sets out to understand photography by exploring its many and various senses of scale. Now, the impetus is to think of scale as a ubiquitous and variegated aspect, or perhaps better, an adumbration of photography that's normally addressed in specific various specialized technical discourses, and to project this concept, to try and develop this concept as a various and ubiquitous feature of photography as an ontological modality of the photographic. Now, in this presentation, I aim to articulate this concept, which will mean that I'll only have time to sketch some of the different concrete forms, practices and discourses associated with it in the broader study. Though my major concern here is to project this conception of photographic scale, the idea I want to get towards does, however, hinge on establishing a material sense of the variety and the ubiquity of the different forms that it takes. So I'll have to do some work in sketching that. So first of all, I'll try and sketch this and to establish a sense of what I mean by this for variation and importance or ubiquity, and then I'll try and work from that to characterize a notion of photographic scale. So, there are a few things more familiar in photography than the fact that photographs that scale things up and down and that they come in different sizes. It's only slightly less obvious to note that they are made and reproduced according to techniques entailing and governing their scaling and rescaling, and that photographs result from the use of formats and arrays of equipment that are infused with differently scaled values. Genres of photographic practice have long toyed with scale effects to create illusions of relative size, whether in amateur or professional terms, or to scientific or artistic ends. The photographic image has proven useful as a tool of measurement, but also grants a tendentious sense of omnipotence over a world full of otherwise unseen and distant things. Our understanding of visual perception has been rendered historical, I would argue, in being de- and rescaled in the face of photography's expansive promise and or its ambivalent threats to set anything and everything within its frames. Overall, I would add, and crucially, photographic devices and the images they produce take on a range of material scales to act as commodities within global circuits of social and economic exchange, so that somewhere down the line, surplus profit can be extracted from their use. Now, even on the basis of this cursory list, it's clear that a wide variety of scalar operations, scaled phenomenon, and forms of scaling are central to both specific photographic practices and to photography in general. To step to one side briefly, one can define scale generally and in preliminary terms as relative magnitude, extent, degree or proportion. To scale is to apply a standard of calculation, to calibrate spatial and temporal dimensions to some end, which often entails establishing a hierarchy of value. Often discourses of scale are criticised precisely in these terms. Scale refers to apparatuses or systems such as the gradated marks on a line or rule used to measure distances and ascertain relative dimensions, or the ratio pertaining between a model and the reality it seeks to represent or to project. Disciplines as various as cartography and ethnography, microscopy and macroscopy, social administration and the policing of populations use photography as part of apparatuses developed to establish and to interpret scales of these and of different kinds, whether they serve to create increasingly expansive photographic viewpoints from ever more distant places and of ever more distant things, whether they exploit the scaled relationships pertaining between things coinciding within photographs, or the potential scope of their archives. However important it is to consider such specific and explicit forms and operations of scale in photography, I would say that this does not exhaust the significance of scale for it. It's important to note that issues of scale in photography cannot be limited to the spatially and temporally coded visual forms and relative dimensions of things represented in photographs, though these too are inherently scaled. We face photographs as readers accustomed to shifting the scale of our interpretation, moving habitually between the scale of a momentary event, situation, life, history, or era, whilst also simultaneously reading them as being bound up with a particular detail, feature, body, locale, nation, or as having global scope and reach. And though it might seem strange to say so, photography faces and seems to read us in much the same way. Photographic equipment is designed around processes of scaling, as in the application of engineered ratios of aperture and focus that contribute to governing the composite process that is the making of a photograph. And these ratios, I would say, take on social, aesthetic, and affective scale as they take on their meaning in use, as they scale the world's visual registers. One might think that cameras stand then as a kind of anticipation of perception, answers to questions that the desire to make photographs has not yet asked, which serves to place them at the centre of a knot of important scalar operations that extend well beyond the visual experience of facing up to an image. Although they only ever occur at, they most importantly occur at that moment of facing up to an image. All of these senses of scale have been set into new relationships with one another through the development and consolidation of mobile and networked digital imaging technologies and photography's persistence, qua photography, as an important form within these. There are more photographs produced and disseminated than ever before, a very often remarked fact, conventionally signalled with reference to the hundreds of millions of images uploaded onto sites like Facebook on a daily basis. Photography's networked digital condition encourages, almost demands description at such engorged statistical scales, and perhaps for good reason. But not only is the act of looking at photographs reset on screen by massively accelerated processes of circulation, but this same situation promises unprecedented opportunities for their inspection and modulation. Also, the modes of bodily comportment involved in taking up a device to make photographs have come to hinge on equipment with rescaled phenomenological horizons, ones that are increasingly evenly keyed into processes of networked global dissemination to establish new relationships that invariably compound globalized commercial imperatives with only apparently immediate seeming modes of perception. So then, I thought I wasn't actually going to show an image today because there's a sense in which the notion of photographic scale that I want to develop, it depends upon the relationship, a play between the variation of all of these different senses of scale. But then I thought it might just be really helpful to look at one. And so this is an image I found while searching for images under variations of photography and scale. It popped up, and then I took a screenshot of it and accidentally closed my browser. So I lost all kind of information about where it's from. And this would be an image that might be across which and in which many of the kind of issues of scale that I'm interested in play. So then evidently, what is it? It's a photograph now anonymous that speaks of itself as being the kind of a product of the kind of panoptical operation of some penal institution. It stands as a coincidence of objects brought together as a document of a presumably violent event. There's a mugshot of a man with a name board to his chest. There's an improvised shiv, and there's a ruler against which it's set. So it's all about scale. It's set there, this very familiar sense of a photograph being used as an object of mensuration, of measure, somewhat casually, this setting of a gradiated line, a standardized rule, in order to give a sense of the scale of something on the same focal plane. But then it's an image that has all sorts of other operations, phenomenon, and senses of scale operating within it. The manner in which it, well, to start with the first image within the image that we see, the archive mugshot of this person, whether victim or perpetrator or whatever his relation to the event that we don't know anything about. Presumably, I would read, as a matter of establishing his anonymity in order for the public release of this image. Digital blur has been rendered over that image and in the production of the image that we see. An operation of a prefiguring anticipation of an image that is an operation of what I'm talking about as an engineered ratio of scale. Then perhaps the way in which that draws our attention, that superposition draws our attention to the standardized scale of use of that size of image produced. We don't know whether it's an analog or a digital image, but produced to a certain standard size, relative size, so that it can be clipped to a file. It's stored in an archive. But then the manner in which the various frames, the white border, the black strips, speak of the digital kind of circulation, modulation of this image, its scaling and rescaling, and the fact that it's lost now, to me at least, amongst the billions of other images circulating around the network. So then an image that seems to me, I would describe it as being, its operation as an apparently straightforward visual image is thickened, in a sense, by these different operations of scale that lead well beyond what we can ascertain by purely visual means, although this thickening happens as a question of these visual means. So I would say that issues of scale in and for photography are structured by a tension between, on the one hand, its function in setting things to measure, bringing them within range, placing them in arrangements, and on the other hand, photography itself, photography's openness as a form to being deranged, transformed technically and historically, and I think this is an important aspect of photography's status as a technical historical form, which is how I tend to think of it. But at the same time, this kind of derangement of photography happens whilst it functions, whilst it operates to produce images, carrying on one of its major tasks, which has always been to deracinate, to tear out of place the things it visualizes. Okay, so there's a projection of some of the questions of scale, the variation of scale, and the manner in which, in the face of a single image, when we're thinking about different formats, different values of photography, and then when we're attempting to think of different historical or technical moments of photography as such, the manner in which I take it to be shot through with different issues of scale. But it's this variation there's a tension in this variation. And I'll go on to try and articulate a conception of photographic scale, which is my kind of invention. It's an attempt to formulate a concept through which to kind of critically and theoretically address photography in scalar terms. So how to go about understanding all of this? The answer explored here starts out from the intuition that its diversity gives the clue to what the concept of scale means for photography. On this basis, I argue that the variation and ubiquity of its senses of scale are not any one particular fact, phenomenon, technique, order, or discourse of scale alone, actually has ontological significance for photography. It actually takes on the shape of being an ontological modality of photography. The task is then to develop the implications of these suggestions by exploring what it means to conceptualize scale according to what one might call the very principle of a variation at work in the play between photography's scales. I project the term photographic scale to denote this dynamic nexus of operations, phenomenon, and ideas, and seek here to articulate it as a concept that elucidates important aspects of photography's sprawling and multifaceted character. As a way of fleshing out the specific conceptual meaning of photographic scale, then, one might observe a truism. There's no photography without it, quite literally. There's no photography without scale. That is, there is no photography of any kind without there being established a manifold of scalar relations which serve as material, phenomenological, and conceptual horizons for the production, dissemination, and consumption, as well as the appearance, form, and meaning of photographs. there are always, as a matter of fact, multiple different and overlapping scalar operations and scale processes at work in each instance and every form of photography. These might be thought of as scalar adumbrations of the photographic that extend across the application of mathematically and scientifically derived technical scales in the design and operation of photographic equipment, the spatial and temporal possibilities held out by the photographic apparatus is so structured, the ways in which this sets the terms for decisions and actions performed in their use, the aesthetic experiences that any resulting photographs might engender, the possibilities of use that photographs as material objects might proffer, and the institutional, commercial and geopolitical spheres of interest within which such uses and encounters may or may not unfold. It's a sentence which makes me want to take a sip of water. So that's a sense that all of those kind of registers, operations of scale, not in the sense of a nested hierarchy of different scales going from the small through to the large, from the detail in the photograph through to the photography as such. I don't think we can, even though my articulation of that did posit it in that way. These are always in mobile and dynamic relation to each other, not least in our attention to photographs, but also in their technical and social operations. This is a sense of the variation of scale. So a range of relatively discrete scalar phenomenon, possibilities and contexts are always operative at these different registers and more. Whilst at any one level, a particular question of scale may appear dominant in our particular reading of this, we may read it for its intended function. Obviously, this first layer of setting this improvised knife to measure. Whilst at any one level, a question of scale may appear dominant, others are also always operative, albeit perhaps in latent form. Or to put it in different terms, other senses of scale always haunt the manifest sense of scale as its supplement. They resonate, so to speak, within the dominant as its under or overtones. But within the variegated field denoted by photographic scale, as I conceive it, three aspects stand out as being predominant. Firstly, that all of photography's production set space and time together and to scale in the form of an image. And I think of that even as a potential. Okay. Secondly, all forms of photography necessarily find some kind of materiality, however attenuated, contingent, dispersed and immaterial seeming, and that one can say they do so in taking on scale. Thirdly, that photography not only has, so to speak, a weighty geopolitical scale, but that its geopolitical import is grounded in and through the scaling operations and processes it operates within and serves to facilitate. So I take these three modes of scale that stand out as being predominant to mean that our understanding and criticism of the visual character of photographic representation, our understanding and criticism of phenomenological encounters with things photographic, and even the fact that photography's representations and its phenomenological forms unfold within capitalism's global order, will remain partial unless we think them in terms of the play that structures their variegation at and as scale. Now, this claim needs, however, to be qualified. Perhaps most importantly, it should be noted that I think recent attempts to theorize photography as a social form in relation to contemporary capitalism are right to establish parallels between the forms of social abstraction shaping of social life and those characterizing the digital condition of photographic images. A good example is Peter Osborne's theorization of the social ontology of the photographic according to its intrinsic historical technical character and shifting cultural formations, which distinguishes between the event of capture and the event of visualization to mark the distinctiveness of the digital image, including photography as one of its most important modes, and to reveal its relation to the forms of abstraction and exchange central to capitalism. Thus, in the digital image, to quote Osborne, the infinite possibilities for social exchange generated by the abstraction of value from use finds an equivalent visual form, end quote. And this form is one in which the post-capture life of inherently and re-realizable technical image visualizations are opened up to the vagaries of infinite exchangeability, to quote Osborne again. Via the multiplicity of visualizations, digitalization draws attention to the essentially derealized character of the image. It is this derealized image, supported in each instance by specific material processes, that strangely corresponds to the ontological status of the value form, end quote. So this, trying to establish this equivalence between social forms, enables Osborne to project an interesting parallel between image and exchange form in the context of the social abstraction of value, the fundamental characteristic of capitalism. But it also provokes questions as to what mediating forms, processes, and experiences might flesh out the space between abstraction and exchange on the one hand, and the specific uses and meanings of photographic images on the other hand. What, one might ask, relates the general correspondence between image and value form to the many different ways in which each instance of the photographic is supported by specific material processes. The concept of photographic scale articulated here is projected into, and I hope promises to help me understand this gap. So then Osborne develops a suggestive, but I think partial, idea of an equivalence between the forms of social abstraction in the kinds of exchange characteristic of capitalism and of the digital image. Seems to offer a way of thinking about photography's geopolitical facet of being scaled, one of its three predominant modes that I want to explore. It promises to link the spatio-temporalities of the relationship between use value and exchange value in capitalism's social abstraction to the moment, to the character, the capture and post-capture moments of the digital image. And it promises to interrupt what on the face of it seem to be the smooth flows of both, of image and exchange value, and to present them as forms in the global scope of their intertwined social production of space and time. But then that's one facet of the idea of photographic scale. I'm trying to I'm going to go on to try and triangulate this in relation to the three different modes, the kind of setting to scale of things in the image, the geopolitical form of this kind of relation between infinite exchangeability of the digital image, and then a question of scale and the materiality, immateriality of the image. To shift to the question of the visual character of representation of the image. So, at a range of levels, scalar operations and phenomenon are central to diverse photographic processes, their uses and the discourses that frame these. But a basic function of all forms of photography is also to register the ostensible spatial and temporal state of things, to fix these together at a certain scale and according to a combination of prefigured and anticipated scales. One significant implication of this is that, in photography, one never encounters space or time, nor for that matter any place, thing, moment or event, other than through a combination of processes that entail the setting of salient aspects of appearance to scale in the more or less enduring but also changeable form of an image. If to scale in this sense is a basic function of photography, photographs of all kinds are also, as a matter of principle, subject to being scaled and rescaled. Any actualization of a photograph at a particular scale, a significant condition for what it might offer to perceptual experience, is inscribed within a horizon of other scales not yet taken. So then I take that to be to inflect this question of the kind of the form of social, the level of social abstraction, to inflect the temporality of the encounters, the processes of the production, dissemination, and consumption of images. This manner in which scale functions to give these categories. It doesn't scale, to my mind, wouldn't displace the importance of a moment, an event, a place, of the affectual or kind of intellectual relation we might have to these things, but it serves to actually give them and structure them, and it's that relation that makes me think scale is interesting, because it cannot then act as other ontological categories applied to photography want to act, cannot act as an essence, or whether empirically presumed and implicit or explicitly kind of metaphysically set over photography. So scale is somehow there, somehow necessary, implies an ontological function, but can't kind of take over the what seems to me to be the traditional ontological function of such categories. Briefly then, just to comment upon the question of materiality. So, amid the somewhat, I find having spoken it in public, what sounds to me like a kind of quite a frighteningly naive sort of statement, that nonetheless I kind of seem to believe, that all forms of photography necessarily take on some kind of material form, however attenuated or dispersed and immaterial seeming they may be, and that they do so in taking on scale. This is of particular interest for attempts to understand the network digital image, insofar as questions of its materiality stand and are often kind of discussed in terms of the stark contrast to earlier conventional formats or that were taken to be defining of photography. So the network's digital image may indeed be defined by the fact that it can choose not to take on the material forms considered primary to earlier photographic technologies. It takes form as something, not necessarily as a visual outcome, that is distributed across different spaces and moments of experience, and the balance between these is constitutively changeable. But in being shaped into such distributed form, it nonetheless takes on scale, I would say. But scale and what it might mean in relation to the image are transformed. This is the kind of the scalar character of the digital in relation to how we might think of it in relation to earlier modes of photography. Its distributed form is changeable as a matter of principle. This needs to be qualified, perhaps, or emphasised, given that here I take myself to have projected or perhaps established the idea that scale as the name of this process can no longer be thought of as rooted in one particular object, determined by a definitive format or characteristic of photography as a medium, nor can it be constrained to the effects arising from any homology with an average visual level of visual perception. Such images as this attain their materiality as variations on a possible admixture of dispersed scales with significant technical, phenomenological and geopolitical registers. One might risk saying, in this context at least, their materiality for the digital image is the taking on of scale, as long as it's borne in mind that this is always in process. I think then that is the end of the part two, the projection of the concept of photographic scale. It's developed as a concept that I've tried to describe in order to establish what I would think of as a social ontology of the photographic. So that's the kind of direction it's going in. But I'll leave it there in order to not go too far over time.
Thank you so much.